With something in excess of 10% of its population having its ancestral roots in Africa, is it possible for America to formulate and execute its African policy without some regard for the wishes of this sizable black minority of her citizens? Despite the fact that ties between the displaced African community resident in America and his motherland have never been entirely severed, until recent years, these ties have for the most part been scanty, unorganized, primarily sentimental and cultural, rather than economic or political, and have in any case involved only a minute fraction of either the displaced or the homeland population. Indeed, the gradual decay in lines of communication between the two groups after the slave trade was ended, and perhaps even more so after the subjection of most of Africa to European colonial domination, led to virtual isolation of the two groups from one another. With encouragement by the mores of the dominant culture, an ever widening gap in understanding and sympathy gradually developed between Africans and American blacks. During the past decade, however, this gap has begun to close itself. Early exceptions. There were rare exceptions to the pattern of mutual isolation, of course, and the renowned American Negro scholar, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, comes to mind as the foremost exponent of the importance of the retention and expansion of communications between Black Americans and Africans, as well as amongst the fractionated Africans themselves. Indeed, to his concept of Pan-Africanism is due much of the impetus for the African independence movements, which ultimately erased the colonial system from much of Africa. The Back to Africa philosophy of Marcus Garvey, which attracted wide support among American Negroes in the mid-20s, probably represents the zenith of American Negro interest in Africa prior to the present decade. In the latter 1930s, Paul Robeson and his wife, through their African travels, writings, and tireless educational efforts, succeeded in bringing to a limited number of middle-class Negroes an awareness that Africa was inhabited by dignified and intelligent human beings, many of whom were looking toward their Black brothers in America for aid in breaking them free from colonial subjection. Robeson's Council on African Affairs was at that time the lone U.S. voice being raised on behalf of the political and economic integrity of the Black Africans. There was, however, little of substance that the Black American could offer to his African counterpart, for the Negro in America was himself still virtually without power, organization, or economic resources. Although the American Negro made no significant contribution in an organized way toward the winning of independence for the African nations, he did provide the movement with considerable spiritual support. Kwame Nkrumah, a leading architect of African independence and himself a product of a Negro college in America, made reference to the role of the American Negro in a speech to the All African Peoples Conference in 1958. He said, "Many of them have made no small contribution to the cause of African freedom. Long before many of us were even conscious of our own degradation, these men fought for African national and racial equality. Long may the links between African and peoples of African descent continue to hold us together in fraternity." Post-World War II. From the Negro press, which was particularly vocal in this regard, and from the growing numbers of African American Negro contacts which developed with the influx of larger numbers of African students in the U.S. following World War II, an awareness of Africa's political and social involvement became a part of the active consciousness of an expanding segment of the Black intelligentsia. As the parallels between the restrictive measures imposed upon Africans in their homelands and the legal and extra-legal discrimination practiced against Negroes here in the U.S. became better understood, the feeling spread that the two struggles were inextricably tied together, and during the mid-50s, the Negro's indifference toward the African began rather swiftly to transform itself into sympathetic concern. With the coming into independence of much of Black Africa commencing in 1957, this concern became mixed with admiration as a procession of Black eloquent statesmen began to be received at the United Nations and the White House with full diplomatic honors. For the middle-class Negro, it became fashionable to boast of some identification with Africa, and such attitudes were institutionalized through groups such as the American Society for African Culture, an artistic and literary association of Black intellectuals which devotes itself to the exchanging of ideas and artistic endeavors between continental and New World Africans. The growing pressures on post-war America to afford her Negro citizens a greater measure of participation and visibility in the nation's affairs had led to the unofficial designation of the Liberian ministership, later raised to the rank of ambassador, as a Negro position, and as early as the later Truman era, it had become rather standard policy to include a Negro in the U.S. as annual delegation to the United Nations. Quite naturally, these Black delegates had unfailingly been representatives of the Negro upper class and were wedded in varying degrees to the administration in power. Despite this, however, these Black diplomats had, on more than one occasion, resisted America's timid policy with respect to African freedom, though they found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being asked to serve as spokesmen for U.S. policy positions, which were mere apologias for the colonial powers and which were contrary to the best interests of all Black people. Thus, criticism and counsel by Negro leadership with regard to U.S. policy in Africa did have a hearing in Washington, but it is unclear to what extent it had an impact because the name of Africa was not being heard in the Negroes' increasingly strident demand for redress of grievances. Growing militancy. Black American grassroots identification with African problems burst upon the international scene during the first Congo crisis, when a group of Black nationalists created a disturbance in the galleries of the United Nations in protest against alleged UN connivance in the murder of Patrice Lumumba. This unprecedented public demonstration of American Negro concern with the African political scene symbolized the entry of a new factor in Washington's political calculations vis-a-vis Africa, and revealed that the treatment of Africa was indeed being carefully observed by some elements in the Black community, elements which were prepared to speak their minds unhampered by middle-class inhibitions and hypocrisy. The principal effect which the UN demonstration had was probably felt not in Washington, but rather in the Black ghettos, where the mystique of Africa was slowly beginning to take hold in alliance with the developing Black nationalism and self-pride which the civil rights movement had aroused. This identification with African political affairs amongst the Black masses perhaps reached a zenith with the visit to Africa of Malcolm X and his effort to enlist the support of the Organization of African Unity for the Negroes' efforts to achieve justice in America. Malcolm's untimely assassination abruptly ended this effort, and no one has yet attempted to revive it. In 1964, a team of the younger, more activist civil rights workers, mainly from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, made a goodwill trip to Africa to demonstrate their interest in that continent and their belief that the two peoples have much in common. Several other prominent young activists in the civil rights movement have subsequently paid Africa a visit. Thus far, these visits have not produced spectacular organizational results, but they have served to further the all-important quest for clarification of the Afro-American's identity and the role for which he must prepare himself. Africa continues to be a major focus of attention amongst the brain trusts of the more militant civil rights groups, and this tie is likely to expand as time goes by. The old line civil rights organizations, on the other hand, have demonstrated only nominal interest in Africa. Probably the major civil rights leader to make an extensive tour through Africa in recent times was James Farmer, former director of CORE. However, there was little follow-up to his trip, nor has Farmer emerged as a vocal spokesman on African questions. American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. The most notable modern effort which has been made to organize American Negroes into some sort of action group in behalf of African interests is that of the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, a loose confederation of organizations having completely or strongly Negro memberships. The conference is under the titular leadership of several prominent civil rights leaders: Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young of the Urban League, Dr. Martin Luther King, Mrs. Dorothy Height of the National Council of Negro Women, James Farmer, and A. Philip Randolph. The accomplishments of the Leadership Conference have been pretty much limited to two national conferences in 1962 and 1964. The 1964 conference, in particular, attracted considerable attention in Washington. Excellent papers were presented dealing with the foremost African political problems in which the U.S. had a direct stake. Secretary of State Rusk addressed the conference, and other high government officials, including Adlai Stevenson, attended various sessions of the conference as spectators. The conference was held at the height of one of the Congo crises, and its final resolutions and statement hardly constituted a resounding endorsement of U.S. policies in Africa. Indeed, it led the New York Times to editorialize that civil rights leaders, and presumably Negroes generally, should confine themselves to expressing opinions on domestic matters and leave international affairs to the so-called experts. The final document of the conference reiterated the statement which had underlain the founding spirit of the first conference. The American Negro community in the United States has a special responsibility to urge a dynamic African policy upon our government. Although we have a serious civil rights problem which exhausts much of our energy, we cannot separate this struggle at home from that abroad. If the United States cannot take vigorous action to help win freedom in Africa, we cannot expect to maintain the trust and friendship of the newly independent and soon-to-be independent peoples of Africa and Asia. Further, the American Negro community has a responsibility in simple terms of historical continuity. Since the turn of the century, Negro leaders and scholars have expressed the concern of Negro Americans for the elimination of colonialism and its evils. While our conference will not initiate a new interest on the part of American Negroes, it will launch a more aggressive determination to make our influence felt on the policies of our government in these critical areas of the vast continent. The political positions adopted by the Leadership Conference were essentially those which independent African nations had been urging for some time. They include condemnation of apartheid practices in South Africa, urging of the return of Southwest Africa to the indigenous population, opposition to independence for Southern Rhodesia under a minority government, termination of U.S. assistance to and dependence on Portugal, and positive efforts to achieve independence for Portugal's African colonies, and recommendations that the Congo problem be turned over to the Organization for African Unity for resolution. An aid program was requested for Africa of a magnitude comparable to that provided to Europe after World War II, and revisions in aid policies and in trade policies toward Africa were urged. Taken all together, the conference resolutions plotted out a dramatic new course for U.S. policy in Africa. Some of it was probably not practicable, at least in 1964. Other portions, however, if heeded, would probably have avoided or minimized some of the conflict and instability which characterizes much of Africa today. Unfortunately, there was no significant follow through on these recommendations beyond a pro forma meeting with President Kennedy, and the leadership conference has continued to exist primarily as a phantom organization. Impact slight. The extent of the American Negro's direct impact on U.S. policy in Africa thus does not appear to have been noticeable. Certainly, it has fallen far short of its potential, a fact which may be most easily attributable to the recency of the Negro's emergence from total political and economic ineffectiveness. The American dream, focusing on the melting pot ideal, which for the Negro has been interpreted as full integration into the white society, is a further obstacle to Negro African identification. So long as the integration ideal remains dominant, though unachieved, the Negro psyche is subjected to a dual and conflicting loyalty. Even today, the search for identity persists as the number one problem of the black man in America. Clearly, however, to the extent that the Negro comes to believe that integration will elude him in perpetuity in America, he is likely to broaden his identification with his national community. The outcome which such a shift in outlook might ultimately have on U.S. policy in Africa, only the most foolhardy would dare to predict.